get out there and realize at 80 years old you still got a life.
We begin with Fox Teen coverage. Kevin Corke is in Buenos Aires with reaction from President Trump. Ellison Barber is live from our nation's capital, but we begin with senior correspondent Rick Leventhal reporting from Houston, Texas, near the former president's home. Rick.
And John, George H.W. Bush moved to this suburban Houston neighborhood with his wife, Barbara, shortly after leaving the White House in the early 1990s. But they had ties, the couple did, to Texas since the late 1940s, and they considered Houston their home. And we have seen some members of the community coming out here today, John, leaving flowers outside the gates of the community, leaving large American flags and smaller flags, and also some funeral wreaths there that you may see on the gates. We can tell you that, according to the New York Times, the president's final words were to his son, George, on the phone on Friday night. When GW said that he loved his father, 41 said, "I love you too." And today, George W. Bush released a statement that reads in part, "After 94 remarkable years, our dad has died. George H.W. Bush was a man of the highest character and the best dad a son or daughter could ask for. The entire Bush family is deeply grateful for 41's life and love, for the compassion of those who have cared and prayed for Dad, and for the condolences of our friends and fellow citizens." His brother, Jeb, George's brother, Jeb, the former governor of Florida, tweeted today, "I already miss the greatest human being I will ever know. Love you, Dad." And granddaughter Jenna Bush Hager posted a photo on Instagram and wrote, "Waking up missing this giant of a man who gave me everything." We have learned that James Baker, the president's longtime friend and former Secretary of State, was among the close circle of people who were here when he passed on late Friday night, according to the New York Times, along with the president's son, Neil, and the reverend from their church here in Houston, John. So a small group of friends and family were at the president's bedside when he passed here last night.
Rick Leventhal in Houston. Rick, thank you. President Trump expressing his condolences to the family and friends of President George H.W. Bush from Argentina, where he's holding high-stakes meetings with world leaders at the G20 summit. Kevin Corke is with the president in Buenos Aires. Kevin?
John, good evening. To be sure, there was plenty of work to do for the president here at the G20 in Argentina, but I think it's also fair to say that much of this day was spent reflecting on the memory of the 41st president of the United States.
We'll be spending 3 days of mourning and 3 days of celebrating a really great man's life. So we look forward to doing that, and he certainly deserves it. He really does. He is a very special person. I spoke with Jeb and George today, and we had great conversations, and we discussed actually for quite some time the father and how much they loved him and how much that he loved them.
Comments coming in from all over the globe. Let's share a comment from the Obamas on the passing of President George H.W. Bush. America has lost a patriot and humble servant in George Herbert Walker Bush. While our hearts are heavy today, they are also filled with gratitude. It goes on to say, George H.W. Bush's life is a testament to the notion that public service is a noble, joyous calling. Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, saying this on Twitter on behalf of the French people: "I convey all of my condolences to the American nation for the loss of former President George Bush. He was a world leader who strongly supported the alliance with Europe. Our sympathy to his family and beloved ones." The leaders all recalling the incredible public service of the man who, as you pointed out, John, was not just a father to another U.S. president, he was also a father of a governor and a war hero in his own right. Meanwhile, here at the G20, President Trump's schedule included that all-important bilateral tonight dinner with China's President Xi Jinping, the two men agreeing to work toward increasing world security and doing so collaboratively. I want to pass along a couple of other notes. You heard the president mention that Air Force One, when he returns to Washington, he's actually going to send it right on to Houston, where it will then ferry the casket of the former president to Washington, where, of course, he will lay in repose beginning on Monday, I believe, of this week. I can also tell you this. The G20 communique, John, was passed tonight. All the nations agreeing to it, broadly speaking, with the notable exception of the U.S. is standing on the Paris Climate Accord. Of course, the U.S. continues to reject that agreement. John?
Kevin Cork from Buenos Aires, thank you. Tributes to President Bush are coming in from all parts of the nation, including Washington, D.C., where many current and former lawmakers recall working directly with the 41st president.
His idea was what Republicans often say in their speeches, but then we forget when we get in the midst of legislation, is that the best ideas and the greatness of this country doesn't come from Washington, D.C. It comes from 1,000 points of light. We're a country that operates best community by community. And so he set up this sort of understated effort that gradually grew into a way of putting the presidential spotlight on men and women in every part of the country who were helping other people and making our country really, as great as it is.
Ellison Barber joins us from Washington, D.C. with more reaction to President Bush's passing. Ellison.
John, lawmakers across the political spectrum are remembering the 41st president as a kind and devoted public servant.
It's just a dignified, a good man. I think that when I think back, he used to write notes and cards to people that he would just simply meet, and I think he had a certain love for people, and I think that that brought dignity to his office and his character.
House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi says duty, sacrifice, commitment, and patriotism, that is what President Bush preached and what he lived, adding, quote, "It was a privilege to work with him and witness his firm commitment to ensuring America lived up to our founders' promise of hope and freedom." Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell described the former president as being blessed with many gifts, but said first among them was his wife and the family that they built. McConnell added, "Today, we accompany the entire Bush family in mourning and prayer, but we also join them in gratitude that God gave the country, this country, George and Barbara Bush." The flags at the U.S. Capitol were lowered this morning to honor and remember a man that some of the people in that building worked with and knew well. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer says Bush was a fine man, and even when he opposed your views, you knew he was doing what he thought was best for America. His yearning, Schumer continued, for a kinder and gentler nation seems more needed now than when he first called for it. South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham said Bush led a life full of extraordinary and honorable service from the cockpit to the White House, and that President H.W. Bush was one of the best examples of goodness, decency, and bravery to ever achieve the presidency. He is a great role model for all of us still in the fight and those who aspire to service in the future. House Speaker Paul Ryan says the late President Bush will lie in state in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, beginning with an arrival ceremony Monday evening. The public will be able to pay their respects from Monday, December 3rd at about 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time until Wednesday, December 5th, 7 a.m. Eastern Time. John?
Ellison Barber in Washington, thank you.
You bet.
As news of President George H.W. Bush's passing spreads around the world, international leaders are praising our former commander-in-chief, sending condolences and admiration for the former president's statesmanship. Greg Palcott is in London with more international reaction.
John, one of President George H.W. Bush's biggest accomplishments was presiding over the peaceful end of the Cold War. With his background in diplomacy, politics, military intelligence, and as vice president at the side of President Reagan, there was probably no one better equipped for the job. As a reporter, I was there at the fall of the Berlin Wall, the upheaval in Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union. I heard the enthusiasm for change and for the support of the U.S. and President Bush. I heard some frustration, too, that he wasn't doing even more. But as analysts now point out, while he talked about the winds of change, he also talked about helping people help themselves. In a statement today, former Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev said, "We happened to work together in years of great changes. The result was the end of the Cold War and the nuclear arms race. He was a genuine partner." President Bush was, in fact, ahead of other Western leaders. Many were wary of a united Germany, but President Bush helped a new Germany be a part of NATO and the European Union. German Chancellor Angela Merkel had this to say today.
I was with Chancellor Kohl in the White House visiting George Bush, and he is the father, or one of the fathers of the German unification, and we will never forget that.
We saw President Bush in Berlin on the 20th anniversary of the fall of the wall. His words on that day: "The wall can never erase your dreams." He helped a lot of people to dream all around the world. John.
Greg Palcott reporting from London. Thanks, Greg. President Bush also being remembered as a decorated Navy pilot during World War II. He enlisted at just 18 years old, 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and about a year after being sworn in, he got his pilot's wings, making him one of the youngest pilots in the Navy. President Bush also survived after being shot down in the Pacific in 1944. The Navy tweeting a touching tribute, writing, quote, "Fair winds and following seas, sir. We have the watch." The people who knew President George H.W. Bush the best used words like decent, caring, and patriotic. A former assistant and friend to the late president weighs in on his legacy in the White House coming up. Plus, top defense leaders gathering today at the annual Reagan Defense Forum in California, praising the late president and his national security legacy. Here's Secretary of Defense James Mattis.
Here in the valley where the spirit of the Gipper lives on, we cannot begin here today without acknowledging the passing of that true patriot, President George Bush.
Annual Reagan National Defense Forum opening today's gathering with a tribute to former President George H.W. Bush. Top national security officials urging attendees to reflect on the end of the Cold War during President Bush's term, saying the event can be used as a lesson for today's security challenges. Jennifer Griffin is live from the Reagan National Defense Forum in Simi Valley, California. Jennifer.
John, we opened this morning at breakfast with a moment of silence for President Bush. We've heard heartfelt tribute after tribute from the nation's top national defense leaders. We heard from Defense Secretary Jim Mattis earlier today. Here's what he said.
We cannot begin here today without acknowledging the passing of that true patriot, President George Bush, one of the youngest aviators in our history. Decorated for valor, a warrior and a statesman. He taught us how to live a life without regret. For all of us who need role models, and I think that is the human condition, he always put others first.
This is my 6th time participating in the Reagan National Defense Forum. For the first time, the forum conducted a survey on how Americans view the military. Among the more surprising findings, for the first time since the Cold War, NATO enjoys more support among Democrats than Republicans. Half of the Americans polled viewed U.S. actions in Iraq and Afghanistan as a failure. More than half of Americans view Saudi Arabia as an enemy. More Americans fear a cyber attack on their personal computer than worry about a terror attack. The focus here at the forum has been on global flashpoints, like Russia brazenly firing on Ukrainian warships and taking Ukraine's sailors hostage. Bret Baier asked Secretary Mattis how he planned to deter this kind of behavior.
Mr. Putin is clearly a slow learner. We're dealing with someone that we simply cannot trust. There is no doubt the relationship has worsened. He tried again to muck around in our elections.
This is the first time that we have heard a senior U.S. official say that Russia attempted to interfere in these last midterm elections just a month ago. Secretary Mattis also told Bret Baier and the rest of the forum that he viewed North Korea as the most pressing, urgent threat. A year ago, North Korea was testing its 3rd intercontinental ballistic missile that could reach the shores of the United States and the east coast of the United States. This year, the discussion here at the forum has been on defense budgets, and if they are cut, will the U.S. be able to deter this kind of aggression from not only Russia, but North Korea, Iran, and others as well? Back to you, John.
All right, Jennifer Griffin from the Simi Valley. Thank you. As we continue to remember President George H.W. Bush, we are getting more insight into what his administration was like at that turning point in history. Ron Kaufman served as White House Personnel Director, Assistant to the President, and White House Political Director during George H.W. Bush's presidency. He also worked in the Reagan administration, and he is our guest right now. Ron, those are important jobs in any White House, but obviously the guy at the top sets the tone. So as you are personnel director, what was Bush 41, President Bush 41, looking for in the people who worked for him?
He wanted people like him, John, who believed deeply in the country and what they're trying to accomplish, and that quality mattered more than anything else. And if you look at the team he put together, particularly on the foreign policy side, a Jim Baker, a Brent Scowcroft, a Colin Powell, a Dick Cheney, it was probably an all-star group of foreign policy folks. The same is true on the domestic side. Great people coming together. And the one thing we had in the White House is an honest belief that we were working for one of the greatest men, not just in this country, in the world at the time. And we all believed we had not to let him down at any point for anything. And it was the greatest moments of my life. I've been working for the Bushes for 40 years, John, and every day of my life I get up and I thank the Lord for the opportunity that they gave me.
He certainly came to the office with an impressive resume: congressman, senator, UN ambassador, CIA director, and also vice president. Nobody knew the world better than George H.W. Bush.
And no one knew the players of the world better than George Bush. It always amazed me, John. He could pick up the phone and call any country in the world, any country. It would know the president, would know the former president, but also would know the head of the security department that took care of those presidents, or the third or fourth level down of deputy secretaries to whatever. He just spent a lifetime of collecting people. I've been in politics way too long, probably, John, and a lot of us have acquaintances. George Bush collected friends, all kinds of friends, bright, articulate friends, and then some like me who weren't quite that good. But we loved working for him, and we believed in our souls we were making a difference in this country.
It's kind of a strange and maybe a personal question, but do you think, did you ever disappoint him?
Way too many times, I'm afraid. Thanks for asking that, John.
Well, I just wonder how he seems like such a gentleman, such a kind soul. I always wonder how he would express displeasure.
Well, he let Barbara Bush do that for him, to tell you the truth. You know, the joke in the White House, John, was if you had to make a mistake, you had to make it with the president or Mrs. Bush. Sorry, Mr. President, we had to make it with you. But they were a terrific couple. And if you made a mistake, they look you right in the eye and tell you, and then forget it. And both the same way. Both were tough taskmasters, tough taskmasters on what you're doing, but warm and heartful afterwards. So it's just a great place to work, John, and I loved every single day.
He was, and he talked about this himself, that he, following in the footsteps of Ronald Reagan, the great communicator, he didn't feel that he had the words, that he was as good at Ronald Reagan, and maybe nobody could be, but at trying to sort of outline what he saw ahead for the country and what he was trying to accomplish.
I think that's fair, and I think he'd agree with that, John. He was a surprise pick for vice president, as you remember, I'm sure. But those two men became great, great friends, and they trusted each other, and each one had the other's back. And they didn't talk about it. It wasn't something that you read in the papers. We didn't leak in those days. We had a great team. But the President Reagan trusted George Bush, particularly on foreign policies. And look, he trusted him enough to take his campaign manager, his best friend Jim Baker, and make him chief of staff. So it was an enormously exciting time to work in the White House. I mean, George Bush ended the Cold War without one shot being fired. And you know, the people talk a lot about the Gulf War, but he would say to you, I think, the best part about the Gulf War is few died, and in the end, with all the parades and the flags after it was all over, it put an exclamation point to the end of the Vietnam War for a lot of people and brought us together in a way we don't talk about much.
It was an extraordinary time, the end of the Cold War, and he was there to oversee the fall of the Berlin Wall and the breaking up of the Soviet Union.
And was smart enough not to, quote unquote, dance on the wall. He realized that if he did that, Gorbachev would be put in a corner among the hardliners in Russia. So he did a fabulous job of staying out of it, not taking credit for it, not saying we won, but kept quiet. And believe me, people around him wanted him to take credit for it. And he refused to, and to his credit, it made it much better for everyone.
Ron Kaufman, who worked very closely with President George H.W. Bush, thanks for sharing those memories.
Thanks for having me on, John.
More continuing coverage of the death of the former president, what he said about his own legacy, and how his administration would be remembered.
It's one of the most golden resumes of any president, and it certainly helped him through what became a one-term presidency.
Scott, and this is the Fox Report. It's the bottom of the hour if you're just joining us. We're looking back on the life of former President George H.W. Bush, who has died at the age of 94. His White House legacy is largely defined by foreign policy, including the coalition victory over Iraq and Kuwait. President Bush's approval rating soared to nearly 90% during that operation, but he argued that history would be the ultimate judge of his leadership in times of both war and peace.
I did not lack for inspiration or support during those 4 years. As to whether we got some things right or could have done things better, the beautiful thing about this library and the 40 million documents here is that history can make that determination.
William Lajeunesse is reporting from the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library and Museum in College Station, Texas. William.
Well, John, you know, the museum is filled with the hallmarks that mark the presidency of George Bush. Some of the things that are emblematic, really, of his presidency: his selflessness, his bipartisanship, his good humor. There's actually a story inside. He came home from a high school soccer game and told his grandmother, "Hey, I scored 3 goals." And she goes, "George, how did the team do?" And that, of course, is the George Bush we came to know and love. This is, of course, he was a first-term president, or rather a one-term president, rather, sandwiched between Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton, both notable and iconic for different reasons, but not unlike President Nixon, whose accomplishments historians now recognize beyond the shadow of Watergate. The executive director of the museum says the Bush years are now finally getting their due.
I've been here since 1993, and I think since he's left office, his ranking among presidents has surely grown.
Yes, I agree.
And it takes 25, 30 years to look back on a president's career and put them into history,
right,
and evaluate whether they were a success or not. And I think history has been and will be kind to him.
So some of the things, of course, John, that you've already talked about that mark that presidency, of course, the fall of the Berlin Wall without firing a shot, the breakup of the Soviet Union and communism, again, without violence, the American Disabilities Act, strengthening the Clean Air Act, and, of course, the Gulf War, which ended in 100 days, liberating Kuwait from Saddam Hussein. Now, the Emir of Kuwait tweeted today, or rather issued a statement saying, quote, "Bush tried to create a new national order based on justice and equality of nations. He never forgot the Kuwaiti people and will remain in their memory." Also, former Soviet Premier Gorbachev writing, quote, "It was a time of great change, demanding great responsibility from everyone. The result was the end of the Cold War and the nuclear arms race." So, John, this obviously the museum here celebrates the president's life. It will be the final resting place in death. We do now know that the Air Force One will pick up the president in Houston on Monday, and then he'll return here to Houston, and then by train to College Station on Thursday, where he'll be laid to rest in a private ceremony. John.
William Lajeunesse in College Station, thank you. Bret Baier has more now on the life and legacy of former President George H.W. Bush.
For a new breeze is blowing, and a world refreshed by freedom seems reborn. For in man's heart if not, in fact, the day of the dictator is over.
George Bush's hardest test as president was giving the green light for Operation Desert Storm. But he is credited with rescuing the tiny, oil-rich nation of Kuwait from Saddam Hussein's million-man army of Iraq. Before George Herbert Walker Bush took his first step into the White House, he learned to walk in Kennebunkport, Maine. Born June 12, 1924, in the town of Milton, Massachusetts, to a family already deeply involved in public service, he was the second of 5 children to Dorothy and Senator Prescott Bush. With high school behind him, George was accepted at Yale University, but put his education on hold. The start of the Second World War beckoned him to serve his country instead. In 1942, George Bush celebrated his 18th birthday by enlisting in the U.S. Naval Reserve. Within a year, he was Ensign Bush, the youngest fighter pilot in the Navy. Taking part in 58 combat missions in the Pacific Theater, Bush was flying his plane on a special bombing mission over China when he was shot down by the Japanese and was forced to bail out at sea. He survived, though his crew did not.
I'm floating around in this raft, paddling, and then all of a sudden saw this conning tower come up and saw the submarine surface.
With the end of the war in sight, Bush set his sights on Barbara Pierce. The two wed in 1945, while Bush was still in the Navy. They would have 6 children, including our 43rd president, George W. Bush, and popular Florida Governor Jeb. Bush left the Navy and graduated from Yale before he and Barbara moved to Texas to find his dreams on an oil field. By the age of 30, he was co-founder and president of Zapata Offshore, which pioneered experimental drilling equipment. But just like his father, Bush was attracted to public service and politics. After losing his first political race for a Senate seat in 1964, he was elected to the House of Representatives 2 years later, serving 2 terms. Encouraged by Richard Nixon to run again for the Senate in 1970, he was defeated a second time. He moved on to high government positions. In 1971, Richard Nixon appointed him ambassador to the United Nations. And in 1973, he became chairman of the Republican National Committee at the height of the Watergate scandal. In that role, Bush urged Nixon to resign for the good of the party.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
President Gerald Ford sent Bush to China as chief of the U.S. Liaison Office. A short time later, Ford called him home to be director of the CIA, and Bush was credited with bringing morale back to the agency. Bush left in 1977 when President Carter entered the White House. By 1979, he was ready to get back into the political ring.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am a candidate for President of the United States.
Bush was seen as a moderate alternative to Ronald Reagan, but dropped out of the presidential campaign after poor primary performances. A short time later, he accepted Reagan's offer to be his running mate. Reagan won in a landslide. During his 8 years as vice president, Bush was credited with softening Reagan's view of the Soviet Union and pressed hard on issues like deregulation and the war on drugs. In a natural progression, Bush became the Republican Party's nominee in 1988, with Senator Dan Quayle from Indiana as his running mate. The Republican team defeated Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis and Texas Senator Lloyd Bentsen.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
During his presidency, the Soviet Union dissolved, the Berlin Wall fell, and Manuel Noriega was arrested, securing the Panama Canal. But everything came to a head when Iraq's Saddam Hussein invaded neighboring Kuwait.
We're not walking away until our mission is done, until the invader is out of Kuwait.
President Bush reacted quickly, committing over 400,000 U.S. troops and building a strong coalition of allies. Operation Desert Storm had begun. The majority of America supported the president's decision to throw Saddam Hussein back into Iraq, and Bush's popularity rating hit an all-time high. Most thought he was unbeatable for a second term. But a broken campaign promise...
Read my lips.
...would come back to haunt the 41st president. And in the fall of 1992, with the war a distant memory, George Bush lost re-election to former Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton. Bush traveled to Kuwait to commemorate the Gulf War in 1993. An assassination plot on his life was uncovered, but Bush was unharmed. It was later discovered the poorly orchestrated plan was the work of the Iraqi intelligence service. A Kuwaiti court would convict all but one of the defendants. Bush retired to Texas with Barbara, getting in a few rounds of horseshoes and celebrating countless birthdays by parachuting out of planes, spending time with the family in Maine and reliving memories of when he was a boy.
I can honestly say that the three most rewarding titles bestowed upon me are the three that I've got left: a husband, a father, and a granddad.
While retired, his life was active until the end, joining forces with former political foe Bill Clinton to raise money for the victims of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami and Hurricane Katrina in 2005. The former presidents formed a close friendship, continuing their charity work and enjoying annual lunches at Bush's home in Kennebunkport, and using his experience and insights to serve as a quiet advisor to his eldest son, the 43rd president. Here, attending George W. Bush's Presidential Library dedication in 2013 and sharing a few words.
We're glad to be here. God bless America, and thank you very much. Good job. Too long.
Bush even kept up with public debate by joining Twitter, where he often shared photos of his colorful socks that became part of his signature look. Age brought health challenges, of course, a form of Parkinson's disease that left him in a wheelchair, and brief hospital stays in his 90s for pneumonia, bronchitis, and a fall in his home. But not enough to keep him out of the limelight, throwing out the first pitch before a 2016 baseball game and pregame ceremonies months later at the Super Bowl in his Houston hometown. Reuniting with his former running mate and Vice President Dan Quayle in July, and then catching a glimpse of the rare eclipse that crossed the country alongside his family in Maine in August. His beloved wife Barbara's funeral, where he met with former presidents, first ladies, and the current First Lady, Melania Trump. Bush recently returned to his vacation hometown of Kennebunkport, Maine, joining fellow veterans for a pancake breakfast before he was hospitalized for low blood pressure and fatigue. This was the first time in decades that neither he nor his wife attended the annual Memorial Day parade. He wrote in a tweet, he is, quote, forever grateful not only to those patriots who made the ultimate sacrifice for our nation, but also the Gold Star families whose heritage is imbued with their honor and heroism. Known for his maturity and straightforward approach, George H.W. Bush called this country to be better.
Cohn guilty plea does absolutely nothing to show wrongdoing by Trump. He joins us, and of course his book, #1 bestseller, The Russia Hoax. Also with us, the author of another bestseller, The Case Against Impeaching Trump, Harvard Law Professor Alan Dershowitz. Professor, let me start with you, and okay, I call it the Sammy the Bull syndrome. 19 murders, you give up Gotti, you testify, no jail time, we'll put you in the witness protection program, you get a house. Mr. Corsi, you say you'd never met Julian Assange, ever had any contact with anybody from WikiLeaks. You give us a connection, you get a get-out-of-jail-free card. Why do I have a problem when something of value is given for testimony?
You should. And Judge Ellis, who presided over the first Manafort case, had that problem, too. He said that kind of thing inclines witnesses not only to sing but to compose. There was a case some years ago in one of the United States Court of Appeals that said when prosecutors offer incentives to witnesses, they're bribing them. Unfortunately, that case was later overruled, but the decision was absolutely correct. Prosecutors offer bribes. Bribes in terms of life.
Is that legal,
liberty,
Professor? Because I don't think I'd offer a bribe to them.
Unfortunately, if you offered a bribe, you go to jail. But if a prosecutor offers a bribe, it's regarded as good conduct. It shouldn't be legal. Tragically, it is. But what we're seeing now is case after case being built against people simply for lying. These are not crimes that occurred before the special prosecutor came to office. He's supposed to have uncovered crimes that had occurred in the past. Instead, he's facilitating and incentivizing the crimes by creating these perjury traps. Virtually all of his indictments and pleas come from people who he got to lie in front of investigators by setting perjury traps for them. The other ones have to do with financial dealings unrelated to the president.
Isn't it amazing,
Where's the beef? Where's the crime?
Thank you. And let me go to Greg. It is amazing that both Corsi and Roger Stone, and I asked them straight up multiple times, did you ever have any contacts with Julian Assange? No. WikiLeaks? No. Any sources close? No. Actually, their email messages bear that out, that they didn't. And here's where they're trying, it seems, to get Donald Trump. The Moscow deal, I don't see, that's what Donald Trump did for a living.
It's perfectly
I don't see anything
legal.
illegal there, number one. And the other is, well, they're trying to connect him to WikiLeaks through Corsi and Roger Stone.
Right.
And they're saying they never talked to the guy.
This demonstrates that it's quite likely that Robert Mueller and his team of partisans have no evidence, not a whiff of collusion involving Trump and the Russians. Trump Tower meeting, perfectly legal. The hacking, that's absurd. Trump wasn't involved in that. A construction project that was abandoned in Russia, that has nothing to do with Trump-Russian collusion. If there was evidence of collusion, then Michael Cohen would have been charged. Instead, Cohen and 4 others have been charged with these process crimes, which, as the professor points out, are actually a creation of the special counsel's presence and have nothing to do with Trump or Trump-Russian collusion. So I suspect...
But here's the problem with the president. Yeah. Here's the problem for the president. Mueller will write a report. The report will be based on the testimony of people who have lied and who have not been cross-examined. When the report comes out, it will be extremely critical. I've used the term devastating, just like the Starr report was devastating and the Iran-Contra report was devastating. But it's devastating only if it's unrebutted, which is why it is absolutely essential for the president's team to demand that the Justice Department not allow the release of the Mueller report until they've had a chance to review it and rebut it. And then both reports, the Mueller report and the president's lawyer's report, come out at the same time so the American public can judge.
Let me ask you this, Professor. This is important. You even said today firing Mueller wouldn't be an impeachable offense. The president said he's not going to do that. And you also talked about this being political now with Mueller. I want to ask you through this prism. Isn't it true, based on the Pentagon Papers, the Supreme Court decision, 6-3, that the New York Times, Washington Post, they can publish stolen material as long as they didn't steal it?
Right. Of course.
Now, I interviewed Julian Assange. He said he didn't get it from Russia, no state party, et cetera. Maybe it was a cutout. Maybe it could have been, you know, we know Hillary's computers in the bathroom closet were hacked by at least 6 foreign intelligence services, if not more. So my question to you is, based on that, that would mean that these emails, be it WikiLeaks or the New York Times that published the WikiLeaks, which is ironic, if they didn't hack and it was given to them from sources, doesn't that mean that what they printed is legal?
Absolutely. The president has the same authority, and the president's campaign has the same authority as the New York Times and the Washington Post. They're allowed to print material that they know was stolen, as long as they didn't tell the people to steal it or give them directions how to hack. Nobody alleges that of the president's campaign. And therefore, they have completely the right to do it. The problem is Mueller is straying away from his mandate to find crime, and he's now looking for political sin, building buildings in Moscow, using stolen material from Assange. These are not crimes. He has no authority to be a roving commissioner to find political sins. So far, I don't see any evidence of crimes except for ones he helped to facilitate by getting people to lie in front of his own investigators.
And Greg, this is what Professor Dershowitz means when he says criminalizing political differences, because all those people that I pointed out lied to Congress. They're not in trouble today like Michael Cohen, are they?
Yeah. I mean, if you're a friend or a supporter of Donald Trump, you get prosecuted for little or nothing. And if you're a friend of Hillary or the Obama administration or a public official nothing happens to you. The fact is that Mueller is presenting to these witnesses a narrative of Trump-Russia collusion. He's demanding under threat they support it. Some of them won't, and Mueller is trying to prosecute them as a consequence. That is unconscionable. It's wrong. It's corrupt.
Fascinating analysis by both of you. Thank you both. No wonder why you both have bestsellers. All right. As we move forward, more breaking news tonight. You won't believe what we're now learning about the caravan. Now 7,000 people in and around Tijuana. Here's a clue. Liberals aren't going to like what we're going to report. I have a mini monologue straight ahead. Also, Geraldo, Dan Bongino, straight ahead.